He looked at me and said the words that cut deeper than anything I had ever heard in my life. "You're not my priority." My hands went still, my breath caught, and for a moment I thought I had misheard him, but no. His eyes were steady, his tone was cold, and the truth was sharp enough to wound me without a knife. I did not argue, I did not plead, I simply nodded and let the silence stretch between us, because in that silence I realized something he had forgotten. I was still the owner of the very house he was standing in. Thank you for watching and for giving me your time. It means more to me than I can ever truly say. And before I go on, I would love it if you tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Because knowing that someone out there is listening makes this story easier to share. When those words left his mouth, I felt a weight pressed down on me, heavier than anything I had carried before. Because this was not a stranger hurting me. This was the very person I had given my best years to. The one I had sacrificed for. The one I believed would stand beside me when I grew tired. I stood there in silence, my mind racing back through all the nights I stayed awake counting pennies just to keep that roof over us. The mornings I left the house before sunrise to make sure there was food on the table, the times I said no to myself so I could say yes to him. I thought of the days when that house was nothing but an empty frame of wood and nails, when I walked through it with dust on my shoes and hope in my chest, believing it would one day hold love, laughter, and a future for him. And now, after all those years, after all that sacrifice, I was nothing more than an inconvenience, nothing more than a burden he could dismiss with a cold sentence. My heart ached, but in that ache there was also a strange kind of clarity. Because sometimes the sharpest betrayals do not need to be shouted, they are whispered, and those whispers are enough to wake you up. I have lived a long life filled with storms and sacrifices, and when I look back now, I see clearly how every step I took was guided by the thought of giving him a chance at something better than what I had. I was a young woman when I lost my husband, too soon and too suddenly, and I found myself staring at bills that never stopped arriving, and a future that looked dark and unforgiving. Yet in those days, I never let despair win. I worked long hours, sewing when I could, cleaning houses, taking whatever jobs came my way just to keep the lights on and food in the kitchen. There were nights when I went to bed hungry so he would not have to. Nights when I patched up his school clothes under the dim glow of a lamp, whispering to myself that tomorrow would be brighter if I just kept going. When I managed to buy that house, it was not because I had wealth or luck. It was because I scraped every coin together. I put down the payout from my husband's insurance, and I told myself that at least our boy would never grow up without a place to call home. That house was more than walls and wood. It was my promise to him. It was proof that love could build something even after death had taken so much from us. I remember walking through the empty rooms the first day with a hammer in one hand and tears in my eyes, determined to make it not just livable but warm, safe, and filled with memories he would cherish. Every birthday candle he blew out, every scraped knee I bandaged, every holiday where we sat at that old table eating simple food but laughing together, all of it was tied to that house. All of it was built on sacrifice and love. As he grew older, I thought my work was done, that I had succeeded in giving him roots and wings. And when he married and started his own family, I believed the house would be a gift that carried him forward, a foundation to build his dreams upon. I signed over nothing, because the deed remained mine, but I opened the doors and let him live there. Let him raise his children in the rooms where he once played. I thought it would bind us closer, that gratitude would blossom into respect. But instead I began to feel the distance grow. The calls became fewer, the visits shorter, and when he did speak to me, it was often distracted, rushed, as though I were a burden cutting into his busy life. I swallowed it in silence, convincing myself he was simply caught up in the responsibilities of adulthood, that he would come back to me in time. But standing there, hearing those words, hearing him dismiss me as though I were an obligation he never asked for, I realized the house I had built with blood and tears had become something else in his eyes. It was no longer a symbol of love and sacrifice. It was simply his possession, something he felt entitled to, without remembering the cost it carried. And that was the moment when my heart stopped pleading and my mind started planning. Because if he had forgotten the story of that house, I was about to remind him in a way he would never forget. The moment that broke everything came on a quiet morning when I asked him for something so simple, something so small that any son with a heart would have said yes without thinking. I had a doctor's appointment across town and my knees were aching that day, swollen from years of climbing stairs and standing on hard floors. So I called him and asked if he could take me. Just an hour of his time, just a ride to make sure I got there safely, nothing more. He didn't even pause before answering, his voice sharp, almost irritated, as if I had asked for something unthinkable. He said, "I'm not your chauffeur. You're not my priority." Those words hit harder than any blow ever could. For a long moment I couldn't speak, my heart pounding, my throat closing, as if my body knew what my mind couldn't yet accept. I remembered every time I had walked miles in the rain to pick him up from school when the buses went on strike. Every night I had rushed from work with tired legs to make sure I was there to clap for him at his games. Every doctor's visit where I sat in the waiting room holding his hand because he was too nervous to go in alone. To think that I, the one who had given everything, had become nothing more than a nuisance in his eyes, was almost too much to bear. He didn't even soften it, didn't even disguise it in polite words. He said it plain, like he wanted me to understand that he meant it, that I no longer mattered enough to take space in his life. When I ended the call, I sat in the silence of my kitchen, staring at the old photograph of his father on the wall. I whispered to that picture, asking if he had seen what had become of our boy, if he had seen how far he had drifted from the lessons we tried to teach him. The tears came slow at first, not from weakness, but from the deep kind of hurt that only comes when love is not returned. Yet mixed with that sorrow was something else, something steady and cold. For the first time, I felt the weight of my silence as power, not weakness. He thought those words would leave me broken, but what they did instead was open my eyes. I began to notice what I had ignored before. The way his wife avoided me at family gatherings, smiling through her teeth, but making sure I always sat at the edge of the table. The way my calls went unanswered while they hosted parties in the house I had built. The way they treated me like an old piece of furniture tucked away in a corner. All those little moments added up, and I saw clearly what I had been denying for years. They were not building a family with me, they were building one without me, and worse, they had forgotten who gave them the ground they stood on. That day, something shifted inside me. I no longer thought of myself as powerless, no longer thought of myself as someone waiting for scraps of attention. I looked around at my small kitchen, the stack of bills, the worn-out chair I sat in, and I remembered the deed tucked away in the drawer. The proof that the house they flaunted was never theirs. I touched that drawer as if it were a lifeline, and I whispered to myself, if I am not a priority, then let me remind them whose name has always been written on those walls. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of a decision forming in my heart. I did not call back, I did not beg, I simply sat in the quiet and let the plan take root. That silence was the beginning of everything that came after. In the days that followed, I carried myself with the same quiet routine as always. But inside, I was watching with new eyes, and everything I saw only deepened the ache in my chest. When I walked past the house, the one that still carried my name on the deed, I noticed how alive it was with noise and laughter that never included me. They threw gatherings where cars lined the street, music spilled from the windows, and strangers walked on the floors I had scrubbed with my own hands. Yet no one thought to call me in, not even for a plate of food or a seat at the table. I stood on the sidewalk once, just for a moment, and I heard him laughing, the kind of carefree laughter I used to fight to protect when he was young. And it cut deep to know that laughter could exist while my presence meant nothing. I began to see their life for what it was, full of spending and showing off, buying things that looked shiny but held no value, always trying to prove they were living grand, while I knew they were drowning in bills. I noticed the envelopes left unopened on the counter when I visited briefly, the tension in their whispers when they thought I couldn't hear, the arguments about money that ended with doors slamming. They lived in my house like it was a throne, but they forgot that thrones are built on foundations, and the foundation was mine. Late one evening, when I could not sleep, I sat at my own table and thought about the years I had poured into building stability. Years where every penny was stretched, where I gave up shoes so he could have books, where I said no to myself so I could say yes to him. And now he could look me in the eye and say I was not his priority. Those words replayed again and again, and each time they grew sharper, until they no longer wounded me. They hardened me. They became the reminder that I was not invisible, that I was not powerless, that I still held something he had overlooked. I kept my silence when we crossed paths, letting him think that I had accepted his dismissal, but within me there was a calm fire burning. I remembered every nail hammered into that house, every wall painted, every tear shed, when I feared I might lose it. I remembered the weight of the papers I kept tucked away in a drawer, the signature that still bound that land and that house to me alone. And as I looked back on all I had seen, the parties, the careless spending, the disregard, I knew that one day very soon I would open that drawer and put an end to this cruel charade. For silence is not weakness. Silence is the sound of strength gathering itself, waiting for the right moment to speak louder than any words ever could. One afternoon, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea cooling in my hands, I found myself lost in thought about what my life had become. And though the pain was sharp, there was also a strange calmness settling over me. I had carried this hurt quietly, but I knew I could not carry it alone forever. That was when a knock came at my door, and when I opened it, I saw a familiar face, a neighbor who had known me for years. Someone who had seen me sweeping my front steps in the early mornings and planting flowers in the spring. She stepped inside with a kindness that felt like a balm on my weary heart, and as we talked, she noticed the heaviness in my voice. Without pushing, she simply asked, "What's weighing on you these days?" Those simple words broke the silence I had been holding so tightly, and before I knew it, I told her what had happened. I told her about the words that had been thrown at me, about how I had been dismissed as though I were nothing, and about how the very house that carried my blood and sweat had been turned into a stage where I no longer had a place. She listened without interrupting, her eyes steady, her presence gentle, and when I finally stopped, drained from spilling out what I had buried, she leaned forward and said something that struck me like a bell. She said, "Do not forget who you are, and do not forget what is yours. That house, those walls, they were built on your back. If they treat you like a shadow, then remind them you are the foundation." Her words gave me something I had been missing for a long time, the reminder that I was not powerless, that I had been carrying the truth in silence all along. That night, lying in my bed, I thought about what she had said, and I realized she was right. For so long I had begged silently for respect, hoping it would return if I just stayed patient, if I just swallowed my hurt, but all that patience had done was convince them that I had no voice left. I reached into the drawer by my bedside and pulled out the folder that I had not touched in years, the one that held the deed, the proof that the house was mine and mine alone. I ran my hand over the paper, feeling the weight of what it represented, and for the first time in a long time, I did not feel weak. I felt steady. I felt certain. In that moment, I decided I would no longer wait for them to realize my worth. I would no longer sit in silence while they lived loudly at my expense. I would act, not in anger, but in the same calm determination that had carried me through every storm of my life. The seed of my decision had been planted, and now, with the words of a kind friend echoing in my ears, it began to take root, firm and unshakable. The very next morning I woke with a kind of resolve that I had not felt in years. And though my hands trembled as I poured my coffee, it was not from weakness. It was from the weight of the step I was about to take. I dressed slowly, carefully, and I took that folder with me, the one holding the deed, the one that carried the truth of all my sacrifices. Walking into the lawyer's office felt almost unreal, as though I had stepped into a moment I had been preparing for without even knowing it. The receptionist greeted me kindly, and when I finally sat across from the lawyer, I placed the folder on the desk with hands that were firm, even as my heart raced. He opened the papers, adjusted his glasses, and looked at me with a calmness that steadied me. "This house is yours," he said simply. "You have every right to make whatever decision you see fit." Hearing those words was like breathing after being underwater too long, because in that instant all the silence, all the nights of feeling invisible, all the dismissals and betrayals, they turned into strength. I explained to him, with as much steadiness as I could gather, that I wanted to sell the property, that I no longer wished for my name to be tied to a place that had been turned into a stage for my pain. He nodded without judgment, his pen moving swiftly, his voice calm as he explained each step. And though my mind was a storm, my voice was clear when I said yes to every page he placed before me. When I signed the papers, I felt the weight of the pen in my hand as if it were more than ink on a page. It was the closing of a chapter. It was my quiet way of saying enough. My heart pounded, but I did not falter, because I knew this was not about revenge. It was about reclaiming myself. Reclaiming the dignity that had been trampled on. As I slid the final paper back across the desk, I thought of the words that had cut me so deeply. "You're not my priority." And I realized that sometimes those who treat you as nothing need to be reminded that everything they lean on is not theirs by right, but by gift. I left that office walking slowly, the cool air brushing against my face, and for the first time in a long while, I felt taller, lighter, not because the burden was gone, but because I had finally chosen to put it down. The silence I carried was no longer the silence of pain, it was the silence of decision. And I knew that very soon, when that envelope arrived at their door, they would finally understand the truth that words alone could never teach them. The weeks passed quietly, each day carrying me closer to the moment when my decision would no longer live only on paper, but would arrive at their doorstep in the form of truth written in black and white. I went about my days calmly, cooking my simple meals, tending to the small garden behind my place, smiling politely to neighbors who nodded as I walked by, and yet all the while I carried a steady fire in my chest. Then one evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in deep gold, I knew the letter had reached them. My phone lit up once, twice, and then again and again, his name flashing across the screen with a desperation I had not seen in years. 17 calls came in that night, followed by messages filled with words I had longed to hear once but now found empty. Apologies spilling out too late, excuses dressed as regret. I sat in my chair, the phone buzzing against the table, and I let it ring. I let it vibrate and flash until the battery dimmed. Because this time it was not me begging to be seen. It was him begging not to be forgotten. I thought of how many times I had stared at my phone in silence, waiting for a call that never came, waiting for a sign that I was still part of his life. And now the roles were reversed. The silence I gave him was not cruelty, it was a mirror, and in that mirror he would finally see himself. I imagined the moment he unfolded that notice, the way his hands must have trembled, the way his voice must have cracked when he read that the house was no longer his stage, no longer his shield, that the walls he thought would stand forever under his command had been pulled from beneath him. I imagined the look on her face, his wife who had smiled through her teeth at me, suddenly realizing the comfort she flaunted was built on a foundation that did not belong to her. Their laughter, their parties, their dismissals, all of it had been balanced on something fragile, and now it was gone. As I poured myself a cup of tea that night, steam rising softly, I whispered to the quiet, "Now you know." There was no joy in it, no gloating, only the steady rhythm of justice that had finally arrived. They had told me I was not a priority, but in that moment, every call, every desperate word, proved that they had never been able to stand without me. And now, as the silence stretched between us, I felt no guilt. Only the calm knowledge that sometimes life delivers its lessons not through raised voices, but through the sound of a door closing that will never open the same way again. Not long after the notice was delivered, he came to me, his face red with anger, his voice raised, his words tumbling out in a storm of accusation. He stood in my doorway demanding to know how I could do such a thing, how I could betray him, how I could take away the very roof over his head, as though the years of my sacrifice had been erased, as though the deed with my name had never existed. I sat there, calm, steady, letting him throw his words into the air, watching as his fury twisted into desperation. And when he paused for breath, I spoke softly but firmly. This was never your house. It was mine. Always mine, and the only betrayal here is how you forgot who built it for you. His wife stepped forward, her voice sharp, trying to smooth things over, painting me as cruel, insisting it was just words said in frustration. But I could see the fear in her eyes, the way her composure cracked at the thought of losing everything they had taken for granted. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue or explain further, because the truth did not need decoration. It stood tall on its own. I told him plainly that the choice was his. He could leave with dignity, or he could be forced out by the law. But either way, the house would no longer shelter his pride. The silence that followed was heavy, and for the first time in years, I felt the balance shift. Not in cruelty, but in clarity. He looked at me then not as though I were invisible, but as though he finally saw the strength he had underestimated all along. When they left that day, slamming the door behind them, the neighbors had already begun to whisper. Some shook their heads, some said I had gone too far, while others nodded quietly, understanding that silence cannot be mistaken for weakness forever. I walked back to my chair, the air still trembling with the echo of their voices, and I felt no regret, only the calm that comes when a heart finally chooses itself over the weight of ungratefulness. I poured another cup of tea, steady hands, lifting it to my lips, and in that simple moment, I knew the storm had broken. And though the gossip would swirl, I would not be moved, because the truth had already spoken louder than anything they could say. After that confrontation, the air around me felt different, as though every shadow that once made me doubt had finally lifted, and I could walk through my days with a steadiness that had been missing for far too long. Word spread quickly, faster than I expected. And soon enough, my phone buzzed not only with his desperate attempts, but also with whispers from relatives, some shocked, some quietly supportive, others wagging their tongues as if my decision had been born from spite rather than from years of silence and dismissal. I heard the gossip as I walked to the market, felt the glances when I passed by the church, neighbors lowering their voices, but never low enough that I could not catch the words. Some said I had been cruel, that a mother should never take such a step, that I should have forgiven and forgotten, while others leaned in close and whispered with admiration, saying they wished they had the courage to do the same. But what they did not understand, what none of them had truly seen, was the weight of all those years leading up to that moment. They had not been there when I cried quietly into my pillow because my calls went unanswered. They had not felt the sting of sitting alone at my own table during holidays, while the laughter I once nurtured echoed behind closed doors that no longer opened to me. They had not tasted the bitterness of hearing I was not a priority after I had made him mine every single day of his life. My decision was not made in a moment of anger. It was not the swing of a sword. It was the slow and steady closing of a book that had been written by my sacrifice and torn apart by his ingratitude. He tried to come back to me, not with humility at first, but with more rage, more accusations, his pride refusing to accept the truth that was now unavoidable. But as the days passed and the reality of his eviction settled in, I could hear the shift in his tone, the way his words softened in his messages, the way apologies filled with excuses began to replace the shouting. Still, I remained silent, because I knew those apologies were not born from love or remorse, but from fear of losing the comfort he had thought untouchable. I had no anger left to give, no energy to waste on words that came too late. I chose peace, and peace meant distance. And while he wrestled with his loss, I began to reclaim myself. I walked through the small condo I had chosen by the lake, its quiet rooms a far cry from the chaos of the house that once carried my sorrow. I opened the curtains in the morning and let the sunlight spill across the floor. I brewed tea and let the steam curl into the air without rush. I sat by the water and listened to the gentle lap of the waves. And for the first time in many years, I felt free. It was not the kind of freedom that dances loudly. It was the kind that breathes slowly, quietly, reminding you that you are still alive, still strong, still whole, even after being told you are not enough. Yes, people continued to talk, some even judged, but their voices no longer reached me the way his once did, because I had learned that respect is not given in whispers or applause. It is claimed in silence when you finally choose yourself. And so I sat each evening in my chair by the window, watching the sky shift from gold to blue, sipping my tea with steady hands, knowing that while they had lost a house, I had found something far greater. I had found my peace. As the days turned into weeks, I settled deeper into that peace. A peace that did not come from forgetting what had been said or done, but from knowing I had finally chosen myself after being overlooked for so long. Each morning I woke without the weight of waiting for a call that would never come, without the ache of hoping to be included in a life that had already shut its doors to me. I walked through my new place slowly, touching the walls, opening the windows, breathing in the quiet as if it were medicine, because in truth it was. I had spent years carrying the noise of disappointment, and now the silence was not heavy, it was healing. I thought often of the house I had given up, not with regret, but with a kind of bittersweet reflection. I remembered the years when it was full of warmth, when the laughter inside its walls was mine to share, when every corner carried proof of sacrifice and love. And then I remembered how it had changed, how I had been pushed to the edges, how my presence had been reduced to an afterthought. Selling it was not just a transaction on paper. It was the final act of letting go of a place that no longer held me. And in that letting go, I found something I had not expected. I found strength in the act of release. He tried again to reach me, softer this time. Messages laced with apologies, promises that things would be different, that he had been wrong, that he had spoken out of frustration. And though part of me longed to believe those words, another part, the wiser part, knew better. Words without respect are just sounds, and sounds fade, but actions remain. He had shown me with his actions where I stood in his life, and though I would never stop being his mother, I would also never again allow myself to be treated as invisible. So I read his messages in silence, placed the phone down, and chose not to respond because sometimes the greatest answer is no answer at all. In the evenings I would sit by the window with my tea, watching the water shift and glimmer, and I would whisper softly to myself, "This is what it means to be free." I no longer needed to prove my worth to anyone, no longer needed to hold on to something that hurt me, no longer needed to beg for love where respect had already withered away. I had given everything, and when I was told I was not a priority, I had finally understood that my own peace had to be. And so I let the quiet carry me, steady and sure, knowing that dignity is not something someone else grants you. It is something you choose to hold, no matter how others try to take it away. There were nights when I lay awake thinking about everything that had happened. Not with bitterness, but with a kind of heavy reflection, because when someone you love wounds you so deeply, the scars are not only on the heart, they sit in the quiet corners of your mind and remind you of all the moments you wished had turned out differently. I thought of the little boy who once reached for my hand when crossing the street, the young man who once promised he would take care of me when I grew old, and I wondered where along the way that promise had been forgotten. Yet instead of drowning in those memories, I began to use them as a reminder that love cannot survive without respect, and that sacrifice without gratitude becomes chains instead of wings. I started to see my life not as something that had ended with his words, but as something that had begun again in the silence that followed. I realized I did not need to sit at a crowded table to feel whole. I did not need to hear forced apologies to feel valued, because the truth was that my worth had never been tied to his recognition. It had always been mine to hold. That realization brought me a freedom I had never known before, a freedom that came not from running away, but from standing still and choosing dignity over pain. I often asked myself if he had learned anything from what happened, if losing the house had opened his eyes to the reality of his words, and though I may never know, I found peace in knowing that the lesson had been delivered in the only language strong enough to reach him. He might have ignored my tears, he might have dismissed my pleas, but he could not ignore an eviction notice signed with my own hand, a reminder written not in whispers, but in undeniable truth. When I walked by the lake and watched the sunlight scatter across the water, I felt something lift inside me, as if the years of being unseen had finally washed away. I no longer carried the need for him to understand, because understanding was his burden, not mine. My burden had been carrying silence for too long, and now that silence had transformed into strength. And as I breathed in the cool air, steady and calm, I told myself that even though he had said I was not his priority, I had made the choice to become my own. In the end, I came to understand that his words, as cruel as they had been, were also the key that unlocked a door I had been afraid to walk through. Because sometimes it takes being pushed aside to finally step forward on your own. He told me I was not his priority, but those words did not define me. They freed me, because they showed me where I truly stood and reminded me that dignity cannot be taken. It can only be surrendered, and I refused to surrender mine any longer. I now live in peace, in a quiet place where the air is calm and the days are mine to shape. And though he may never fully understand what he lost, I know what I gained. I gained the strength to choose myself. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of my story. Your time means more to me than I can say. And if this story touched you, please subscribe so we can share many more truths together.